He did what the cipher could not do. He rescued himself. For 2 days he combed the wreckage in 5-minute forays and devised a harness for his shoulders. He attached an air tank to the harness and connected the tank to his spacesuit helmet with an improvised hose. He wriggled through space like an ant dragging a log, but he had the freedom of nomad for all time. He thought. In the control bridge, he taught himself to use the few navigation instruments that were still unbroken, studying the standard manuals that wrecked the navigation room. In the 10 years of his service in space, he had never dreamed of attempting such a thing, despite the rewards of promotion and pay. But now he had Vorga T:1339 to reward him. He took sights. The Nomad was drifting in space on the ecliptic, 300 million miles from the sun. Before him was spread the constellations Perseus, Andromeda, and Pisces. Hanging almost in the foreground was a dusty orange spot that was Jupiter, distinctly a planetary disk to the naked eye. With any luck, he would make a course for Jupiter and rescue. Jupiter was not, could never be habitable. Like all the outer planets beyond the asteroid orbits, it was a frozen mass of methane and ammonia. But its 4 largest satellites swarmed with cities and populations now at war with the inner planets. He would be a war prisoner, but he had to stay alive to settle accounts with Vorga T:1339. Foyle inspected the engine room of the Nomad. There was high-thrust fuel remaining in the tanks, and one of the 4-tailed jets was still in operative condition. Foyle found the engine room manuals and studied them. He repaired the connection between fuel tanks and the one jet chamber. The tanks were on the sun side of the wreck and warmed above freezing point. The high thrust was still liquid, but it would not flow. In free fall, there was no gravity to draw the fuel down the pipes. Foyle studied a space manual and learned something about theoretical gravity. If he could put the Nomad into a spin, centrifugal force would impart enough gravitation to the ship to draw fuel down into the combustion chamber of the jet. If he could fire the combustion chamber, the unequal thrust of one jet would impart a spin to the Nomad. But he couldn't fire the jet without first having the spin, and he couldn't get the spin without first firing the jet. He thought his way out of the deadlock. He was inspired by Vorga. Foyle opened the drainage petcock in the combustion chamber of the jet and tortuously filled the chamber with fuel by hand. He had primed the pump. Now, if he ignited the fuel, it would fire long enough to impart the spin and start gravity. Then the flow from the tanks would commence, and the rocketing would continue. He tried matches. Matches will not burn in the vacuum of space. He tried flint and steel. Sparks will not glow in the absolute zero of space. He thought of red-hot filaments. He had no electrical power of any description aboard the Nomad to make a filament red-hot. He found text and read. Although he was blacking out frequently and close to complete collapse, he thought and planned. He was inspired to greatness by Vorga. Foyle brought ice from the frozen galley tanks, melted it with his own body heat, and added water to the jet combustion chamber. The fuel and the water were non-mixable. They did not mix. The water floated in a thin layer over the fuel. From the chemical stores, Foyle brought a silvery bit of wire, pure sodium metal. He poked the wire through the open petcock. The sodium ignited when it touched the water and flared with high heat. The heat touched off the high thrust, which burst in a needle flame from the petcock. Foyle closed the petcock with a wrench. The ignition held in the chamber, and the lone aft jet slammed out flame with a soundless vibration that shook the ship. The off-center thrust of the jet twisted the Nomad into a slow spin. The torque imparted a slight gravity. Weight returned. The floating debris that cluttered the hull fell to decks, walls, and ceilings, and the gravity kept the fuel feeding from the tanks to the combustion chamber. Foyle wasted no time on cheers. He left the engine room and struggled forward in a desperate haste for a final, fatal observation from the control bridge. This would tell him whether the Nomad was committed to a wild plunge out into the no return of deep space, or a course for Jupiter and rescue. The slight gravity made his air tank almost impossible to drag. The sudden forward surge of acceleration shook loose matter of debris, which flew backward through the Nomad. As Foyle struggled up the companionway stairs to the control deck, the rubble from the bridge came hurtling back down the corridor and smashed into him. He was caught up in this tumbleweed in space, rolled back the length of the empty corridor, and brought up against the galley bulkhead with an impact that shattered his last hold on consciousness. He lay, pinned in the center of half a ton of wreckage, helpless, barely alive, but still raging for vengeance. Who are you? Where are you from? Where are you now? Where are you bound? Chapter 2. Between Mars and Jupiter is spread the broad belt of the asteroids. Of the 1,000 known and unknown, most unique to the freak century was the Sargasso asteroid, a tiny planet manufactured of natural rock and wreckage salvaged by its inhabitants in the course of 200 years. They were savages, the only savages of the 25th century, descendants of a research team of scientists that had been lost and marooned in the asteroid belt 2 centuries before when their ship had failed. By the time their descendants were rediscovered, they had built up a world and a culture of their own, and preferred to remain in space, salvaging and spoiling, and practicing a barbaric travesty of the scientific method that they had remembered from their forebears. They called themselves the scientific people. The world promptly forgot them. SS Nomad looped through space, neither on a course for Jupiter nor for the stars, but drifting across the asteroid belt in a slow spiral of dying emanicle. It passed within a mile of the Sargasso asteroid, and it was immediately captured by the scientific people to be incorporated into their own little planet. They found Foyle. He awoke once while he was being carried in triumph on a litter through the natural and artificial passages within the scavenger asteroid. They were constructed of meteor metal, stone, and hull plates. Some of the plates still bore names long forgotten in the history of space travel: Indus Queen, Terra, Syrtis Rambler, Mars, Three-Ring Circus, Saturn. The passage led to great halls, storerooms, apartments, and homes, all built as savage ships cemented into the asteroid. In a rapid succession, Foyle was borne through an ancient Ganymede scow, a Lassell ice borer, a captain's barge, a Callisto heavy cruiser, a 22nd century fuel transport with glass tanks still filled with smoky rocket fuel. 2 centuries of salvage were gathered in this hive: armories of weapons, libraries of books, museums of costumes, warehouses of machinery, tools, rations, drink, chemicals, synthetics, and surrogates. A crowd around the litter was howling triumphantly. "Quant stuff!" they shouted. A woman's chorus began in excited bleating. Ammonium bromide, 1 1/2 grain. Potassium bromide, 0.3 grains. Sodium bromide, 0.2 grains. Citric acid, quant stuff. "Quant stuff!" the scientific people roared. "Quant stuff!" Foyle fainted. He woke again. He had been taken out of his spacesuit. He was in the greenhouse of the asteroid, where plants were grown for fresh oxygen. The 100-yard hull of an old ore carrier formed the room, and one wall had been entirely fitted with salvage windows. Round ports, square ports, diamond, hexagonal. Every shape and age of port had been introduced until the vast wall was a crazy quilt of glass and light. The distant sun blazed through. The air was hot and moist. Foyle gazed around dimly. A devil face peered at him. Cheeks, chin, nose, and eyelids were hideously tattooed like an ancient Maori mask. Across the brow was tattooed Joseph. The O in Joseph had a tiny arrow thrust up from the right shoulder, turning it into a symbol of Mars, used by scientists to designate male sex. "We are the scientific people," Joseph said. "I am Joseph. These are my brethren." He gestured. Foyle gazed at the grinning crowd surrounding his litter. All faces were tattooed into devil mask. All brows had names blazoned across them. "How long did you drift?" Joseph asked. "Wagga," Foyle mumbled. "You are the first to arrive alive in 50 years. You are a puissant man, very. Arrival of the fittest is the doctrine of Holy Darwin. Most scientific." "Quant stuff!" the crowd bellowed. Joseph seized Foyle's elbow in a manner of a physician taking a pulse. His devil mouth counted solemnly up to 98. "Your pulse. 98.6, Joseph said, producing a thermometer and shaking it reverently. "Most scientific." "Quant stuff," came the chorus. Joseph proffered an Erlenmeyer flask. It was labeled Lung, Cat, CS, Hemotoxylin, and Eosin. "Vitamin?" Joseph inquired. When Foyle did not respond, Joseph removed a large pill from the flask, placed it in the bowl of a pipe, and lit it. He puffed once, then gestured. 3 girls appeared before Foyle. Their names were hideously tattooed. Across each brow was a name: Joan and Moira and Polly. The O of each name had a tiny cross at the base. "Choose," Joseph said. "The scientific people practice natural selection. Be scientific in your choice. Be genetic." As Foyle fainted again, his arm slid off the litter and glanced across Moira. "Quant stuff!"